So recently I beat Bloodborne for the first time, and I started to get curious about the main 26 weapons since this is the only FromSoft game with each main weapon being unique. But instead of looking at a top 10 or a tier list video, I figured it would be more fun to beat the game with every single one and see for myself how good they are. So today I'll be beating Bloodborne with all 26 weapons on one character. With that said, let's get to the rules for this run. Rule number 1. I must beat every single boss with a weapon before I can go to the next one, so I must beat the game 26 times. Now, for the sake of my sanity, I will not go over all 22 bosses 26 times. I will just focus on important parts for each run and the weapon itself. If you would like to see the run in its entirety, I will leave a link to the VODs in the description down below. Now back to the rules. Rule number 2, I must start with what is considered the best weapon in the game by the community, and work my way down to what is considered the worst weapon in the game by the community. Rule number 3, paper, beast blood pellets, and empty phantasm shell are allowed, but combat items and hunter tools that deal damage are not. The reason for allowing paper, pellets, and empty phantasm shell is that some weapons can use them and some cannot. And for this playthrough, I want to know all the pros and cons for each weapon. Rule number 4, I must use the original weapon. In Bloodborne, there are 2 alternate forms for each weapon, the Lost and Uncanny. These alternate forms usually make the weapons have better gem slots, but I just want to test their normal forms for this run. And lastly, no guns. For me to truly learn these weapons and understand them, I need to beat every boss without relying on parries from the gun. This does not include the Rider Palash or Rifle Spear since their unique attribute is being a gun. With the rules out of the way, let's get this crazy run started. I start off by naming my character Ho because it will take 26 shafts to satisfy me. For the class, I go with the military veteran due to it having the most balance between strength, skill, endurance, and vitality. Now, in the tier list, we can see Holy Moonlight Sword is the first weapon. Unfortunately, there's no way to get this weapon this early, so I decided to go with the Saw Cleaver first since it's also an S tier, and it's one of the starter Pokemon you can pick. Just a quick side note, on the first run, I made sure to get all 26 weapons, and I made sure to always have the upgrade materials I needed to upgrade the weapons to plus 10 before the next run. Even though Saw Cleaver has to start from 0, the Saw Spear will give me the same experience overall, so it's fine. With all that jargon out of the way, let's get this party started. Starting off, the Saw Cleaver strictly deals physical damage in both of its forms. Its untrick form uses quick horizontal attacks with the added benefit of having serrated damage, while in its trick form it sacrifices serrated damage for more vertical range. The Saw Cleaver early on was simply a monster. With its serrated damage and its incredibly fast trick attack, I was easily able to take out the first half of the game with no issues. A quick side note, for Bloodstar Beast and Father Gascoigne, I did not allow myself to use blood cocktails or the music box. I felt like it would have trivialized the fights, and in using these items, it would not help me learn the weapons. So I chose to opt out of using them for that reason. Continuing on, I didn't hit my first mini roadblock until Rom. At this point, I was only leveling strength and skill to help with damage, so I was a bit squishy. So when finding Rom and her child fodder made things a bit more complicated. But I eventually learned to just hit it and quit it. No daddy spiders for you kids, because Miyazaki wants all kids to be orphans in this game. Besides Rom, none of the base game bosses gave me any trouble. I even first tried Ebertis, who I definitely thought was going to kill me with her thick ass hitboxes. But that's where my luck would end because oh lordy, the DLC gave me a run for my money in this cycle. Ludwig's first phase was giving me some trouble even with using oil and fire paper, that it took me 9 tries to get him to his second phase. Once finally there, I had no issues in finishing him off. Lady Maria, on the other hand, decided she couldn't be outdone by no man, and decided to beat my ass 28 times, and I kind of liked it. Really, the issue I ran into was not being able to use a gun. I have always fought her with a gun, so not having one meant I actually had to learn her fight. Funny enough, it's pretty straightforward, just dodge to the right and you could dodge pretty much all of her attacks. Then Orphan decided he was tired of being the only one parentless and decided to take it out on me. 36 times to be exact. Unfortunately for me, I came back each time unlike his mother. That lucky bitch. Overall, Phase 1 wasn't too tricky to figure out, but Phase 2 was a whole other ballgame. With Orphan embracing his inner crackbaby, I'm lucky I only died 36 times. But fortunately for me, I was finally able to figure it out. Kind of. With the DLC out of the way, Gurman and Moon Presence did not put up a fight at all. And with that said, the first cycle comes to an end. So what did I think of the Saw Cleaver? I think it has the strongest trick attack in the game. Not only does the trick attack do a massive amount of damage, it also can build beast meter like crazy. On top of all that, the weapon is fast, uses paper, and has serrated damage. The only real downsides are its trick form not being that useful, and the saw having short range, which forces you to be up close when fighting. Overall, a very strong weapon that's easy to learn. Makes perfect sense why people like it so much, and it's the weapon of choice for speedrunning. With all that said, time for the second cycle, the Holy Moonlight Sword. Now, the way Bloodborne's NG plus cycle works is a bit different than other games. Instead of the entire game getting the same percentage boost, each area and boss gets their own unique percentage increase. If you'd like to know more about it, check the link in the description down below. So the Holy Moonlight Sword is a great sword in both forms. Both forms do physical and thrust damage, but when it's tricked, it can do arcane damage. In its trick form, the charge and non-charge R2 can send out a projectile attack, while the L2 sends out a thrust attack that can knock back enemies. Both of these attacks deal 100% arcane damage at the cost of 1 bullet, and 70% arcane damage when you have no bullets. When starting off using this weapon, I was super excited to use its arcane form due to how cool it looked and how fun it was to use its projectile attacks. What I did not take into account was how many enemies in the game have high arcane resistance, especially on NG+, and my tenacity to want to spam the R2 and L2 attacks, which ended up causing me to die to Gascoigne 5 times trying to kill him with these attacks. Not going to lie, it was super fun pushing Gascoigne around with the thrust attack, so it was worth fighting him 6 times to kill him with the thrust and projectile attacks. Another issue that I encountered early on was how slow the weapon felt coming off from the Saw Cleaver. Dealing with the drastic change in speed of the weapon, not knowing bosses' resistances too well, and learning weapons that have a set element cannot use paper or change its elements with gems caused me to die multiple times. A couple of other bosses that gave me trouble were the Shadows of Yharnam and Lawrence. The Shadows of Yharnam gave me more trouble due to having to figure out how to deal with them. Unfortunately, dealing with them on NG+ and using a slower weapon gave me more trouble than I would like to admit. So instead of just killing the fire guy as soon as possible, I found out you can lower the fire guy and the sword guy both below half health before they will transform into their second phase. From here, I just killed the sword guy first since he likes to spam his Gomu Gomu no sword attack, then the fire guy, and then the candle guy. For Lawrence, it was honestly me still not knowing the fight that well that caused me to die 16 times. But I did find out that all beast type bosses have a higher resistance to blunt damage and arcane damage, except for Carl for some reason. So dealing with him with a weapon that's not a great matchup, plus not knowing his moveset that well, led to a lot of frustration. But I was able to pull it off in the end. Now, for some bosses that didn't give me any trouble in this cycle were Rom, Ibridus, Lady Maria, and Gurman. Rom and Ibridus were simply no match for some good old thrusting. For Lady Maria and Gurman, it was just simply too easy to stagger them with the Moonlight Sword. I was even able to beat Orphan in 3 tries, much better than the first cycle. And with that, I finished my second cycle. The Holy Moonlight Sword has great range, not just with its projectiles, but also the length of the weapon. It has righteous damage in both forms, can stunlock humanoid bosses easily, hits like a fucking truck, and it has great damage type versatility. Sadly, it's stuck to arcane damage, it's a bit slow, and it builds beast meter slowly. Overall, the Holy Moonlight Sword is a great weapon, but I was expecting a bit more out of it with it being rated the highest out of all 26 weapons. With that said, let's move on to the third cycle, the Whirligig Saw. The Whirligig Saw, or as I like to call it, the Wiggle Saw, is a unique weapon. In its untrick form, it is a mace that does mostly blunt damage with a few moves that do thrust damage. For its trick form, it becomes a lawnmower that deals predominantly physical damage while having serrated damage. While in lawn mode, it has the unique ability to mow down enemies with its L2 attack. Also, when doing a charge R2 and continuously holding it down, it can deal up to 3 extra hits. Honestly, for the majority of this run, I just used the transform state. I did try my best from time to time to use the mace form or even its trick attack, but never really found a reason to use them. I also learned early on that the L2 really isn't that great against most bosses. I found just doing R1 and R2 attacks, I was able to dish out more damage faster. With the Whirligig Saw being able to use paper, I was easily able to melt through bosses, especially the beast type bosses. I was shocked to see Lawrence of all bosses go down in a couple of tries. Honestly, the Wiggle Saw was doing so well, I forgot for a while I was on NG plus 2. Really, only 2 bosses gave me a bit of trouble, Shadows of Yharnam and Orphan. For the Yharnam boys, it's mostly because I'm not that experienced when it comes to foursomes. I can only handle so many shafts at one time. Why are my hands moving up and down? For Orphan, well, he decided to remind me I was playing on NG plus 2. I didn't have any issues getting to his second phase, but I did have issues dealing with his second phase. And after dying 10 times, I finally realized my damage output wasn't that great. At this point, I was still using base game gems, and they just weren't going to cut it anymore. So I decided to go gem farming and found 2 tempering radial gems, which I ended up using these 2 gems for the majority of my runs going forward. Once I got my damage up, I didn't have any more issues with Orphan. Besides that one hiccup, this run went great, and to top it off, I was able to get my first try Gurman and Moon presents. With the run out of the way, let's talk about the Whirligig Saw. Starting off, it has serrated damage. It's good at building beast meter, amazing versatility doing all damage types. It can use paper and has great range and stun locking potential in its trick form. Sadly, its trick attack is a bit too slow, but does make up for it in damage. As much as I love the trick form's charge R2 attack, it also falls victim to being too slow. Besides those 2 things, I honestly can't think of any other negatives to the weapon. Makes perfect sense to me why people like it so much. With that said, let's move on to the 4th cycle, Ludwig's Holy Blade. Ludwig's Holy Blade is a straight sword that can turn into a great sword. For the straight sword, it can do physical and thrust damage, and for the great sword, it can do blunt and thrust damage. Nothing too fancy about this weapon, plays like any Souls game straight sword and great sword. Honestly, I thought the Moonlight hit like a tank until I started using Ludwig's Holy Blade. With this bad boy being able to use paper and build beast meter easily, bosses were dropping like flies in this run. It didn't matter that it didn't have serrated damage, it still had no issues taking out beast type bosses. Hell, I even beat Lawrence on my 2nd try, and I still had no clue how to fight him properly at this point. Even poor Ludwig got bullied by me using his own weapon. Maybe if he did not abandon his original sword, he would have had a chance of beating me. Cockiness aside, a newborn child kicked my ass 6 times, so I guess I don't have too much room to talk either. Plus dying to a wet nurse and a psychotic nerd 2 times. But we can just ignore that. Overall, Ludwig's Holy Blade made the 4th run super chill. With that said, let's talk about the weapon. Ludwig's Holy Blade is versatile in all damage types, has righteous damage in untrick form, it can use paper, you can pick between playing fast or slow depending on your situation, builds beast meter very well, great at stun locking with its great sword form, and overall has great range. Unfortunately, its trick attack isn't anything to write home about, which is a shame since how useful both forms are. The charge R2 is a bit slow in both forms, and lastly, the weapon takes a bit longer to limb break in comparison to other weapons. Makes sense why a lot of people see Ludwig's Holy Blade as their favorite weapon and why it made it into S tier. But, with that said, time to move on to the 5th cycle and into A tier, the Burial Blade. The Burial Blade is a curved sword in its untrick form and a scythe in its trick form. Both forms can deal physical and arcane damage. The curved sword form has a crazy speed with good poise break, while the scythe form sacrifices some speed for range. Its charge R2 has great range and does massive damage at that. Another weapon that just obliterated base game except for Gascoigne. I was still learning the weapon at this point, so I made some mistakes that led to me dying twice. Even with this weapon not being able to use paper, it was able to build beast meter like crazy, which allowed me to deal massive damage insanely quick within the fight, so most bosses didn't even last a minute. On top of that, its range and poise break helps on bosses like Mikolash, Lady Maria, and Gurman. Even when these bosses would try to dodge a normal R1 attack would still hit them. Also, this is one of the few weapons that can poise break Lady Maria and Gurman out of their super armor attacks. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Lawrence. Lawrence is where I died the most in this run, 14 times to be exact. He already hit like a tank in NG, but in NG plus 4 I would basically get one-shotted or two-shotted by him. Sadly, this will stay the same throughout the rest of the runs. On top of that, he has 37,186 HP at this point, so it felt like I was fighting a tank with a pocket knife. But through hard-headedness, I was able to slay the first douche. Besides that, the rest of the run was pretty chill. With that run done, let's talk about the Burial Blade. It has phenomenal range in both forms, can break through bosses' super armor, has a fast trick attack, and is amazing at building beast meter. The only two downsides that I can think of is it can't use paper due to being stuck to arcane, and it doesn't do either serrated or righteousness damage. It honestly is a great weapon and a fantastic reward for beating Gurman. Definitely one of my favorite runs. With that said, let's move on to the 6th cycle, the Hunter Axe. The Hunter Axe is a hand axe in its untrick form and a halberd in its trick form. Both forms focus on physical and blunt damage. The halberd form has one of the strongest charge R2 attacks in the game. You can literally spin to win with this form. But don't sleep on the hand axe form, it's no joke either. It has great stun potential with its R1 combo, as great knockdowns with its charge R2s. I was smacking bosses left and right and even put Daddy Gascoigne in his place. The only trouble I ran into in base game was Logarius and Ebritus. Logarius was because I found out the hard way he can hit you through the pillars, and Ebritus at NG plus 5 can basically one-shot you even with 67 vitality. For the DLC bosses, they were pretty chill. For Ludwig, I was able to use the halberd form to easily break limbs, especially his head. And for Lady Maria, I learned how good the hand axe form can be for stunning enemies. Lawrence, once again, was the only one to give me a real trouble, taking me 10 tries to beat him. But what can I say, it's Lawrence. I also learned in this run that Phantasm Shell strictly adds 80 arcane, so at this point I started using it. Unfortunately, it does not help when you have 0 vials and taking on Moon Presence. Sometimes you gotta throw a boss a bone every now and then immediately take it away. And with that, the 6th cycle comes to an end. Time for some weapon talk. The Hunter Axe has great stun and knockdown attacks in both forms, great range and trick form, overall quick attacks with a quick trick attack, and can use paper. Some downsides are the charge R2 is a bit slow, has low thrust damage so viscerals are not so good, builds beast meter a bit slow, and lastly has no serrated or righteousness damage. A great strength weapon for smacking your enemies around. 10 out of 10 would recommend. With that said, let's move on to the 7th cycle, the Raikuyu. The Raikuyu is a twin blade in its untrick form and a dual blade in its trick form. Both of these forms focus on dealing thrust and physical damage. This weapon has one of the highest combinations for attacks in the game. Also, this is where we hit the cap for NG scaling. At NG plus 6, it no longer scales past this point, which might make you think it will make things easier, but even with me having 99 vitality and 15% HP rune on, I still get one-shot or two-shotted by every boss in the game, especially the DLC. And I also decided all my attack stats cannot go past 50 so that I can compare the weapons fairly. With that said, let's get to the Raikuyu. Oh, speaking of getting two-shotted, the Claire Beast decided to show me firsthand that fact. First time in this run dying to him. NG plus 6 is no joke. Not going to lie, I struggled a good bit figuring out this weapon. Gascoigne killed me 5 times, Ligarius killed me 9 times, and the fucking one Reborn killed me once, which hurts me more than dying to Orphan more than 30 times. I don't know what was going on in the base game, but something clicked for me in the DLC and I was able to tear through the bosses. Ludwig and Lady Maria went down on the first try, and Orphan only took me 3 tries. Not too bad if I say so. Damn it, don't show that. You saw nothing. Ignoring that hiccup, I was even able to demolish Gurman and Moon Presence without dying. Overall, the Raikuyu has great speed, which leads to great stun potential to humanoid bosses. Crazy fast trick attacks, high combo potential, and can use paper. Although it has great combos, it does lead the weapon to have high skill ceiling, so there's a bit of a learning curve learning this weapon. Also, its dual blade form does not have a charge R2, so you need to keep that in mind when wanting to do backstabs. And lastly, it doesn't have either serrated or righteousness damage. The Raikuyu is an amazing weapon, but definitely requires some work to get the hang of it. And with that, the 7th cycle is done. Time for the 8th cycle, the Shikage. The Shikage is a katana weapon in both forms. In its untrick form, it does physical and thrust damage, whereas in its trick form, it does predominantly blood damage, with some thrust attacks. When in its trick form, the user will lose 0.85% of their health continuously. On top of that, the charge R2 and L2 will use a portion of the user's health. The trade-off for this is you get to deal rapid poison buildup. Once built up, the enemy will lose a portion of their health. The Shikage is normally used with the Lost form since it allows easier access to blood attack up gems. But for this run, I had to use the normal form, and after an hour of trying to get blood attack ups for radials, I gave up on that and just did tempering gems instead. Lucky for me, blood tinge still benefits from physical up, just not as much as blood up. Sadly, once again, I died to the cleric beast. Just shows you again, 1 or 2 slip ups at NG plus 6 or higher and you will die to any boss. Even the one reborn again, sadly. But not all bosses smacked me so easily. The Yarnum boys stood no chance to the brute force of this weapon's untrick form, and the Dark Beast Parl crumbled underneath the onslaught of blood attacks. Unfortunately, this go around the Wet Nurse gave me a run for my money, but not as much as Ludwig and Lawrence. Those two hairy bastards smacked me silly. Lud got me 5 times, whereas Lawrence got me 16 times. Even with being tossed around by some furries, I was easily able to take out Lady Maria using her own blood attacks against her, and made quick work of Orphan. Then Gurman heard how I humiliated Lady Maria and decided to kick my ass 9 times. And to add salt to injury, Moon Presence beat me 4 times. Definitely not my best run, but at least I didn't die to Celestial Emissaries, oh god damn it. Besides all those deaths, I was able to get the run done. I know I'm not making the Shikage look good, but it's more user error than the tool itself. The Shikage has great speed with good damage output. With blood proc, you could do massive damage. It also has great combo potential with its trick attacks and builds beast meter quickly. The big drawback to this weapon is its blood form. As strong as it is, it requires a lot of skill to use. With it doing tick damage plus how much damage you can do to yourself, you can easily kill yourself when using this weapon, since you cannot rally that health back. On top of all of that, it is stuck to blood damage, which isn't overall bad, but does lose out when punishing resistances. Even with those drawbacks, it's still an amazing weapon that can tear through bosses' HP. With that said, let's move on to the 9th cycle, the Saw Spear. The Saw Spear is the exact same as the Saw Cleaver, but its trick form is a spear that keeps its serrated damage and has thrust damage. The Saw Spear was simply amazing. With it being able to use paper, thrust damage, and the broken trick attack of the Saw Cleaver, I was able to do this run in 3 hours and 40 minutes. And that's with me dying multiple times and dicking around with chat. Funny enough, only one boss gave me trouble in this run, and it was Ibridus. I truly understand now how bad her hitboxes can actually be. With her wide ass hitboxes and me really wanting to thrust her to death led to me dying 5 times, which was the most times I died to a boss on this run. Hell, I was even able to get my first try kill on Lawrence. It only took 9 playthroughs, but I finally did it. Simply, the Saw Spear made this run a walk in the park. And with that, the 9 cycle comes to an end, so let's talk about the weapon. As stated before, the Saw Spear is the same as the Saw Cleaver, so they share the same perks. It has serrated damage, but on both forms, can use paper, has a godly strong trick attack, it can build beast meter like crazy, it can do thrust damage, and the trick form is actually usable. Really, the only downside that I can think of is that the trick form's thrust attack is stuck to the R2. Honestly, the Saw Spear is better than the Saw Cleaver. Even when comparing damage from the wiki, you could see the Saw Spear can dish out more damage, and on top of that, because it does more thrust damage and focuses more on skill, it will lead to the player dealing more visceral damage overall. Definitely deserves to be an S tier with its counterpart. With that done, time for the 10th cycle, the Blades of Mercy. The Blades of Mercy is a dagger that can trick into 2 daggers, and focuses on dealing physical and arcane damage. Its untrick form has the fastest charge R2 in the game, and its trick form is the fastest weapon in the game, with the longest R1 combo string. I'm going to be honest, I had a very rough time using this weapon. I found out I ended up struggling when fighting against beast-type bosses. I ended up dying to Cleric Beast twice, Amelia once, Ludwig 7 times, and yes, his first phase is a beast type, and finally Lawrence 11 times. The only beast type boss that didn't kill me was Carl. I just found the damage to not be that great against them even with building beast meter quickly. On the other hand, the Blades of Mercy made quick work of Gascoigne, Lady Maria, and Gurman. With its fast speed, it was easily able to stun lock them into submission, which makes sense when it's a tool used for hunting other hunters. So even with having a rough time during this run, I was able to get the job done. Now let's talk about the Blades of Mercy. They have great speed and a massive array of combinations that can be used to take on enemies. They can stun lock humanoid bosses like no other and have a charge or two that is faster than a speeding bullet. Sadly, there are some drawbacks. It's stuck to arcane, so no paper, which I do feel would have drastically made this weapon better, but probably why they locked it to arcane. It has very short range, so short in fact that it's very easy to miss with this weapon even with being up close. It's not very strong against beast type bosses, and lastly a very high skill ceiling. I do believe this weapon in the right hands can destroy everything in the game with no issues, but with the limited time I had with the weapon, I just wasn't able to do that. With the 10th cycle done, time for the 11th cycle and our intro to B tier, starting with Bloodletter. Bloodletter is a mace in its untrick form that deals blunt and thrust damage, whereas its trick form is a spiked glaive that deals purely blood damage. When going into its trick form, the user will lose 20% of their HP, but unlike the Shikage, it can be rallied back. The trick form has a special L2 attack that does massive AoE damage, but at the cost of 179 frenzy buildup. Before doing this run, I had done a Blood Tidge only run where I did use the Bloodletter for the later half of that challenge. So with having that prior experience and this weapon being a great strength - blood weapon, I didn't run into many issues in base game. The only boss that put up a good fight was Ligarius. My issue for this fight was over-relying on the trick form. During Ligarius' first phase, it did so well I just kept wanting to use it, but during his second phase he becomes faster, and the mace form would have been better in hindsight when dealing with them. I also underestimated how good the mace actually is. During the Abritus fight, I was shocked at how much thrusting damage it could do to her. It's like they say, it's not the size that matters, but how you use it. Which I wish I would have known for Amygdala, because I definitely did that fight the hard way. Really, the only boss that threw me for a loop was Ludwig. I honestly thought I knew this fight well, but after dying to him 25 times, I realized I didn't know it that well. I only made it to his second phase 3 times out of the 26 attempts. Hell, I was even able to beat Lawrence on my second try, and y'all have no clue how much that hurt me deeply since I like Ludwig more than Lawrence. On the bright side, I made quick work of Orphan, Gurman, and Moon Presence to make up for it. And with that, the 11th cycle comes to an end. Bloodletter has great versatility with range and speed. It has no issues in both forms with stunning enemies while dishing out major damage. The big things that hold it back is it being locked to blood damage, not having serrated or righteousness damage, and slow R2 attacks, especially its trick form. This weapon helped me a lot in my Blood Tinge run and did wonders in NG plus 10. And with that, it's time for the 12th cycle, the Beast Hunter Safe. The Beast Hunter Safe is a long lost cousin to the Saw Cleaver and Saw Spear, but don't think they're the same because it plays drastically different in comparison to them. The Safe's untrick form is a curved sword that focuses on range while dealing physical and blunt damage. Its trick form sacrifices range for speed and gets the added benefit of being able to do thrust damage. Its trick form has a more unique moveset in comparison to the Saw Cleaver, especially its trick attack that can be used tactfully to avoid attacks and close gaps. The Beast Hunter Safe was honestly super fun to use. With its fast-paced playstyle, its ability to use paper, and builds beast meter easily, it made NG plus 11 feel like normal NG. Even without serrated or righteousness damage, this weapon had no issues tearing through beast types or kin types. Even other hunters couldn't handle the pressure of this weapon. Being able to trick attack away and close gaps just felt so good, plus it just was overall a fun playstyle. The only boss that even stopped me from speedrunning this run was Ludwig. I honestly think after that last run, it just mentally fucked me up for this fight, which led to me taking 7 tries to beat him. Because after I finally finished Ludwig off, none of the DLC bosses or the final bosses stood a chance. I was able to take all of them out on my first try, even Lawrence. This weapon deserves more love than it gets. Overall, the Beast Hunter Safe has great speed and range with the best gap closer in the game. It can use paper, build beast meter fast, and has versatility with all damage types. Unfortunately, its untricked form leaves room for improvement. It has great range, just not the overall best moveset, which led me to not using the untricked form during my run with it. And sadly, no serrated or righteousness damage. At the end of the day, a very satisfying weapon to use, and you should definitely give it a shot. The 12th cycle down, time for the 13th. Simon's Bow Blade. Simon's Bow Blade is a curved sword in its untricked form that focuses on physical and thrust damage, whereas its trick form, a bow, uses mostly blood damage, but can do physical and thrusting as well. Even though Simon's Bow Blade has bow in its name, the blade part does insane damage. This curved sword destroyed everything in its path, and it can do this without good beast meter buildup. Not to forget, it can poise break humanoid bosses with no issues. This is another weapon that can break through Lady Maria's and Gurman's super armor. Even with all this, you can keep your distance from the boss and deal good damage, which I used to finish off Orphan, so you never really need to play risky. The bow also makes getting head breaks like Amygdala and Lawrence pretty easy. Unfortunately, Lawrence decided I wasn't allowed to first try him this time, so it took me 5 tries this go around. Even with that mess up, I only died 6 times this entire run. That's the least amount of deaths in all 26 playthroughs. The Simon Bow Blade did not disappoint. Now, let's talk about it. The weapon has great range with its curved sword and bow counterpart. It can break through super armor, and it hits like a truck but moves as fast as a crack baby orphan. Now, it does have some downsides. It's locked to blood, so no paper. It does not have serrated or righteousness damage. The charge R2 does 2 hits, but to get the backstab, the second hit must land. If it doesn't, no backstab. And lastly, it builds beast meter slowly, but it would be broken if it didn't. With that said, the 13th cycle comes to an end. Time for the 14th cycle and into the C tier, starting with Beast Cutter. The Beast Cutter in its untricked form is a serrated club, while in its tricked form is a thick-ass whip. Both forms can do serrated damage and blunt damage. The whip form has the longest melee range in the game. The Beast Cutter was an interesting weapon to use, mostly because I was expecting to use the whip form more, but found myself using the club form for the majority of the run. It's no shocker this weapon had no issue cutting through Beast, but it also had no issues with bashing hunters' heads in. I almost one-cycled Gascoigne with it, and it can break through Lady Maria's super armor. A true Unga Bunga weapon. Now, I did give the whip a fair try, but it did more harm than good. I even died to the one reborn when trying to use the whip and the living failures twice. But the living failures hit like a freight train, so I'm not too shocked. So with it being so slow, I just never found a reason to use it, especially with how good the club form was. With just the club, I was easily able to dismantle the DLC bosses and had no issues bashing Gurman's head in. Even though I bashed the whip, I had to finish the run off with it, even if it was just the trick attack. With the run finished, let's talk about the weapon. The Beast Cutter has good poise break, can break super armor, its club form is weirdly fast, technically has good range, both of its forms have serrated damage, and it can use paper. Unfortunately, its whip form is too slow for the majority of the bosses, but I can see it being used for mobbing. It struggles to build beast meter, and it's stuck to just dealing blunt damage. So, for all of those club maniacs out there, this is the weapon for you. With the 14th cycle done, it's on to the 15th cycle, the Boom Hammer. The Boom Hammer is a hammer that goes boom. Its L1 just lights the hammer on fire and allows the user to do fire damage with swings or a big boom with its charge R2. I was super surprised when using the Boom Hammer how simple the moveset is. With the trick just being putting the weapon on fire, it only took one boss and I knew everything this weapon could do. With its fire damage and easy combos, I was easily able to make work of the base game. Sadly, I did die to the Witch of Hemwick. Murphy's Law can be a real bitch sometimes. The Boom Hammer did make up for it for its easy trick attacks, and of course the satisfying boom attack. But that all faded away for me once I got to the DLC. Upon fighting Ludwig, I found out the hard way the Boom Hammer sucks at breaking limbs. I say this after beating the game with all 26 weapons. I made the mistake thinking that after breaking Ludwig's chest in the second phase that all weapons can easily break it again, since that's what I experienced up until now. But sadly, the Boom Hammer couldn't. Trust me, I tried 32 times. It wasn't until I stopped trying to go for the break that I was able to beat Ludwig. Sadly, blunt weapons are not the best when it comes to limb breaks. I wish my suffering stopped there, but Lawrence and Orphan both decided to jump in the fun. Lawrence was a pain because he has a godly fire resistance, and Orphan's a pain because he's a crack baby. Luckily, the Boom Hammer didn't struggle with Lady Maria or Gurman and his Moon Mommy. Overall, the Boom Hammer is very easy to learn, builds beast meter very quickly, and dishes out massive damage while having great knockbacks. The downsides are it's stuck to fire damage and blunt damage. It has no serrated or righteousness damage, and it just isn't the best at limb breaks. I did have fun using the Boom Hammer, and don't be afraid to give it a shot just because I like to die a lot. With that said, we could put the 15th cycle behind us to start the 16th cycle, the Kirk Hammer. The Kirk Hammer is a sword in its untrick form that deals physical and thrust damage, while in its trick form it is a hammer that deals blunt damage. The sword and trick attack share the same moveset as the Ludwig's Holy Blade. I personally wasn't expecting the Kirk Hammer to do that well, but I'm happy to say it proved me wrong. Not only does the hammer do great damage, it can easily stun bosses. I was extremely impressed with how easily I could stun bosses like Ligarius or Lady Maria. It was also this run that I finally figured out Lady Maria was weak to arcane and not fire. Most hunters are weak to fire, but I guess I should have known better, especially with her third phase. Go figure. Probably my favorite thing to do is charge an R2 and follow up with another R2 to send some bosses flying, like Mikolash. It was very satisfying to bully him this way. Even though it did impress me, the hammer can be punishing if you're not being wise when timing its slowish attacks, or especially the fun charge R2. This definitely gave me some trouble with Orphan. If I'm being honest, I should have used the sword form for this, but I really just wanted to bonk the little shit. And I'm happy to say I did, even if it did take me 8 tries to do so. Besides that, I really enjoyed this weapon and was sad to see the run come to an end so quickly. With that said, let's talk about the Kirk Hammer. The Kirk Hammer has a great versatility with doing all damage types, being able to use paper and having good range. It also builds beast meter quickly and has righteousness damage on its sword form, and has a devastating charge R2. At the cost of great power comes speed, which can make this weapon harder to use, but once understanding the timing of this weapon, skill can compensate for this. The Kirk Hammer is every caveman's dream weapon, and it honestly deserves more credit than people give it. With that said, time for the 17th cycle, the Church Pick. The Church Pick is a toothpick in its untrick form that deals physical and thrust damage, whereas in its trick form it is a pickaxe that deals strictly thrusting damage. With the Church Pick mainly focusing on thrusting damage, I decided to go farming for gems that increase thrust damage. Ibridus and Lady Maria will be in for a good time for this one. A lovely surprise to this weapon, just like the Kirk Hammer, it has a strong charge R2 attack with a follow-up R2 attack that can also make bosses go flying. And you know I had a field day with Mikolash. I also found out the Church Pick has a hidden modifier called Beast Hunter Effect, which deals 20% more damage to Beast. This is not serrated damage, and from the wiki, more Beast type enemies are susceptible to this effect than serrated, which explains why I wasn't really struggling against Amelia, Dark Beast Parl, or even Ludwig. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for Lawrence. Luckily, it only took me 4 tries to beat him. Now, with this weapon doing thrust damage, it made easy work of Rom, Amygdala, and especially Ibridus. Plus, with it doing thrust damage and having a high skill scaling, visceral damage was through the roof. You can ask Orphan, he was not too happy about me plucking his butthole extra hard this time around. On top of all that, the toothpick form actually does good damage and builds the beast meter extremely well. Overall, this weapon made easy work of NG plus 16. The Church Pick has great range with this trick form, it can use paper, has righteous damage and beast hunter damage, strong charge R2 combo for knockbacks, has great stun potential and beast meter buildup in its untrick form, and lastly deals more visceral damage. Really, the only downside to this weapon is it can be a bit tricky to use, especially the pickaxe form. I did find myself from time to time whiffing with it, but that's probably more of a user error than a tool error. And with that, we can move on to the 18th cycle, the Ligarius Wheel. Ligarius Wheel is a hammer in its untrick form that deals blunt damage, whereas its trick form is a spinning hammer wheel that deals arcane and blunt damage. The trick form can spin the weapon up to 4 times, increasing the arcane damage and giving it the added benefit of dealing tick damage, but at the cost of losing HP per spin. The upside to this, it can all be rallied back. The Ligarius wheel gives the player a high risk, high reward playstyle, and I was here to embrace that. So I used the Cleric Beast as my test dummy to get the hang of using my new Beyblade, and then make quick work of Father Gascoigne with it. But my confidence got the better of me. During my fight with the Bloodstar Beast, I kept spinning the wheel even though I couldn't recover my health fast enough, which cost me to earn my first loss to the Bloodstar Beast. After that said defeat, I am glad to say I learned my lesson. From here, I was able to control my hunger to spin the wheel for extra damage, which helped to take down the man who this weapon is named after. Not going to lie, it was super fun to smack Ligarius around with the Ligarius wheel, even though he has high arcane resistance. Sadly, my urge to spin the wheel would come back at times, which would cause me to die almost immediately. On top of that, I ran into another rough patch near the end of the run with Orphan, with him having high arcane defense and being quick, and made dealing with him a pain in the ass. Luckily, even with the weapon being slow, the charge R2 has a decent range to it, so I was able to get the backstabs off for this fight, which still took me 16 tries to beat him, so not that great overall. But after Orphan, I got to bully Gurman and Moon Presence. With all that said, the 18th cycle comes to an end. Overall, the Ligarius wheel can do crazy damage, build beast meter quickly, and has great stun potential. Sadly, for the cost of power, you have to gamble your health, which with poor planing can easily kill you. On top of that, it's stuck to arcane and blunt damage, and it's a bit slow to use. Ligarius wheel is a gambler's dream, but it takes one damn good one to use it properly. With that said, it's time for the 19th cycle, the Threaded Cane. The Threaded Cane is a cane in its untricked form that can deal thrust damage and physical damage, whereas its trick form is a whip that deals mostly physical damage but can do thrust damage. A unique thing about the Threaded Cane is it has righteousness damage and serrated damage. On top of that, it also has a plus 0.15 to skill scaling when in trick form. Simply, more damage. I'm just going to get this out of the way. Why the hell is this near the bottom of C tier? The Threaded Cane was a fucking monster. It was able to limb break bosses with no issues, and with its whip dash attack, it can even reach large bosses' heads. Let's not forget its crazy thrust damage potential. I don't think Ebritus has ever been thrusted this hard before, even with the church pick. The only time I ran into an issue was when I was being overconfident. This happened with the One Reborn, with me not noticing the corpse attack above me, and Murgo's Wet Nurse with me literally rolling into an attack to get one-shotted. The majority of my deaths on this run came from Orphan, and that was only 3. Not going to lie, the winning tip did get a bit spicy, but I pulled it off. The majority of bosses this run went down with no issues. Even Lawrence, the Big Daddy himself, went down on the first try. And if it wasn't for a few hiccups, it probably could have been my fastest run. I was able to do the entire NG plus 18 run in 4 hours. With that said, let's go over everything about it. The Threaded Cane has an amazing versatility with being able to use paper, having good speed, great range, and being able to use both righteousness and serrated damage. On top of that, it builds beast meter quickly, especially its whip's R2 attack. And it has great visceral damage from the thrust and skill scaling. The only 2 downsides to this weapon is the whip can miss from time to time, but I feel like it can easily be mitigated by proper positioning. And finally, it can take a bit longer than some of the other starting weapons to pop off. Besides that, the Threaded Cane is simply an amazing weapon to use, and it definitely deserves more praise than what it gets. And with that, we move on to the 20th cycle, the Stake Driver. The Stake Driver is a dagger in both forms. In its untricked form, it focuses more on physical damage, while in its trick form, it focuses strictly on thrust damage. The special thing about its trick form is when you do a charge R2, it does a massive thrust attack. And whoever you thrust it on will need a wheelchair afterwards. Most people praise the Stake Driver's Big Bang attack, but honestly, its untricked form is super strong. It has extremely fast attacks and it builds beast meter quickly. I learned this early on with the Cleric Beast. It was super satisfying building the meter up, then doing a trick attack to finish him off with a Big Bang attack into his nuts. The speed and damage of this weapon were so great against bosses like Ludwig and Orphan that they both went down on the first try. The big issue that I ran into with this weapon was wanting to use the Big Bang attack on everyone, so it ended up leading me to dying quite a bit. In total, I only died 9 times this run. That's only 1 less than the Threaded Cane. Probably the most shocking deaths were to the Celestial Emissary and Living Failures. But that's what I get for trying to explode all over them. At least I was able to give Ebritus a good time. Another upside to the stake driver doing good thrust damage is good visceral damage, which I satisfyingly got to finish off the run with. Overall, the stake driver has fast attacks, can use paper, build beast meter well, and has the strongest R2 attack in the game. Unfortunately, it does have some downsides. It has short range, so you have to be super close to bosses. Its charge R2 is super slow, and it can't use either serrated or righteousness damage, and has a high skill ceiling. I honestly think people try to use the charge R2 too much, which causes them to think negatively of this weapon, when you need really good timing to use the charge R2. Another C tier weapon that deserves more love, but it surely has no issues spreading it. And with that, it's time for the 21st cycle and the start of D tier, the Beast Claws. The Beast Claw is a unique weapon due to its pairing with the Beast rune. You can use it without the rune, but it's meant to be used with it. In its untrick form, it is a singular claw that does physical damage and thrust damage, while in its trick form, it becomes 2 claws dealing physical damage and blunt damage. The perk to using this weapon is the ability to build beast meter without beast blood pellets, and you can cosplay as the Cleric Beast, Dark Beast Parl, or even Lawrence. The start of the run went really smooth, especially with the Gascoigne fight, but I ran into a bit of trouble with the Bloodstar Beast in Amelia. I only died to the Bloodstar Beast once, but it took me 5 tries to beat Amelia, which started to make me think this weapon was not that great, but afterwards I started killing bosses with no issues. With its quick attacks and it easily building beast meter, I was able to first try every boss. Poor Lady Maria got bullied. After I won the fight, it looked like a damn crime scene with me drenched in her blood and all of her blood in just one spot. It was an absolute massacre until I got to Lawrence. Then it clicked for me. The Beast Claws are just not that good against beast type bosses. Maybe it's just me, but the majority of my deaths from this run came from beast type bosses except for Gurman, who killed me 3 times, but that just makes sense lore wise. Hell, I even first tried Orphan with these bad boys. Really, besides the beast type bosses, this weapon was an absolute monster at NG plus 20. The Beast Claws can use paper, they are extremely fast, can stun humanoid bosses easily, it has no issue building beast meter, doesn't need beast blood pellets, and you get to look like a werewolf. Even with how good this weapon is, it definitely has some downsides. You're constantly a glass cannon due to always building beast meter, doesn't have righteous or serrated damage, has very short range, and it struggles against beast type bosses. Even with that, it's still a fantastic weapon for damage, speed, and cosplaying. To be honest, I'm a bit shocked to see it in D tier. With that said, let's move on to the 22nd cycle, the Tonitrus. The Tonitrus is a mace in both forms dealing blunt damage. When tricked, it applies bolt damage to the weapon. It's very similar in playstyle to the boom hammer, except for the boom part. But the Tonitrus gets the added benefit when tricking to get a plus 0.4 to arcane scaling, which is an extra 40 bolt damage. I honestly did not have high expectations for this weapon. With it being stuck to blunt and bolt, I figured it wouldn't be that good, but it definitely surprised me in this run. I was even more shocked that I beat Dark Beast Parl on my first try, when on paper this weapon would not be a good matchup for it. I even beat Ludwig on my first try, and he normally gives me a lot of trouble at this high of scaling. In base game, the only boss that gave me trouble was Murgo's Wet Nurse. I honestly thought I was going to struggle more against Amelia with her being a beast type, but I had no issues first trying her. Heck, even Lawrence went down in 2 tries, if you can even believe that. The boss that gave me the most trouble in this run was actually Orphan. He took me 9 tries to beat him, but definitely felt more skill issue than weapon issue. I honestly was relying too much on the lock-on system at this point, and that will rear its ugly head in a later cycle. But with all that said, the Tonitrus had no issues crushing NG plus 21. The Tonitrus has great speed and amazing trick attack for building beast meter. Best part of all, it's an extremely easy weapon to learn. Now, it is locked to bolt damage, so no paper. Its visceral damage is not that great due to focusing on blunt damage, and it cannot do righteousness or serrated damage. Even with those drawbacks, the Tonitrus definitely proved me wrong, and showed me I shouldn't judge a weapon by its design. And with that, it's time for the 23rd cycle, the Amygdalin Arm. The Amygdalin Arm is a club in its untricked form that deals blunt and arcane damage, whereas in its trick form is a type of whip that deals physical thrust and arcane damage. Starting off in the run, didn't have too much issues with the weapon until I got to Dark Beast Parl, where I found I just kept whiffing with the whip. For the life of me, I kept missing with it, which caused me to die. I thought it might have just been me, but I ran into this same issue with Aquarius and ended up dying twice to him. Worst of all, I died to Amygdala, not just once, but twice. First time dying to him out of 23 runs. But it gets worse. I died to Celestial Emissary and the Living Failures. I was just struggling with this weapon. I will say this, it did do a great job at stunning Gascoigne and Lady Maria, but its club combo does have a pause in it which would give them time to get out of the stun lock, which Lady Maria took advantage of to kill me twice. But hey, I did beat Lawrence in 2 tries and Orphan on my first try. I honestly think it just took me a minute to get the hang of this weapon. The whip isn't really like any of the other whips, and the club doesn't hit as hard as I was expecting it to. Hell, this weapon does a great job at building beast meter, but it still didn't feel like it packed that much of a punch. Lucky for me, that didn't stop me from first trying Gurman and Moon Presence. It wasn't my cleanest run, but I got the job done. The Amygdala arm has great range, good versatility with multiple damage types, builds beast meter fast, and has no issue stunning humanoid bosses. Sadly, the whip's attacks are easily to whiff, so you do need to be a bit close for them to connect. It unfortunately does not have serrated damage or righteousness damage, it's stuck to arcane damage, and has a slow charge R2. It's surprisingly a Unga Bunga weapon that requires a bit of skill to use, and with that, the 23rd cycle comes to an end, for the 24th cycle to start. The Cos Parasite. The Cos Parasite must be used with the Milkweed rune to be used properly. In its untrick form, it is a singular tentacle that can hit up to 2 times, and in its trick form, you have 2 tentacles that give you more reach. In its trick form, its L2 attack does a massive AoE attack. In both of these forms, the Cos Parasite does purely arcane damage. Oh dear lord, where do I fucking start with this weapon? Starting off, I spent a couple of hours trying to get a arcane gem, but come to find out, waning gems are the hardest to get in arcane. And I went down 4 layers deep just to get an abyssal triangle gem when it was supposed to be a waning gem. So I said fuck the rules and just used the uncanny version. Oh, don't worry, even with its better version, this run was still utter fucking hell. So, the Cos Parasite doesn't do any physical damage, so Beast Blood Pellets don't work with it, and when you're at NG +6 and higher, Blood Pellets help tremendously when it comes to dealing damage. On top of that, it's stuck to arcane damage, and most of the bosses in the game have high resistance to it. So, with it not being able to use pellets, and being stuck to arcane, I died a lot. But worse, I did dog shit damage the entire time. So, most fights would last 7 to 20 minutes for me to just die at the end. The biggest culprit to this was the One Reborn, where after dying 9 times, I had to hide on the balcony poking him for 16 minutes straight just to kill him. But it doesn't stop there. With the low damage, even Amelia could just heal herself back up to the point it gave me PTS flashbacks to Moonlight Butterfly during my Bare Fist run. Oh, just wait, motherfuckers, it gets worse. Ligarius having very high arcane defense made my shit damage even more shitty, and when having low damage causes long drawn out fights, usually leads to higher chances of fucking up, which I did 11 times. Worst part is, I got him to low health multiple times to just die. But oh, Murphy's Law wasn't done with me yet. Ludwig kicked my ass 14 times, Lawrence only 8 times, and oh, Orphan killed me 67 fucking times. I had to break another rule of mine and get Arcane to 99 to help me with damage, and that barely helped. The biggest issue with Orphan was that I couldn't get backstabs off due to Cos Parasite having the slowest charge R2 attack in the entire game, with the added effect that it does 2 hits, and the second hit has to hit to proc the backstab. So you can get the first hit, but if the second hit doesn't hit, no backstab. Why, Miyazaki? Why? So with the lock-on, this just wasn't going to work. It wasn't until I said, fuck the lock-on system, let's see if I can do it without it, that I was finally able to backstab Orphan in the first phase. After that, it took me some time to figure out how to backstab him in the second phase, but I eventually figured it out to finally beat him. On the plus side, I did find out you can backstab him after he transforms. All in all, the weapon does have a good AoE attack that can hit behind walls and stun enemies, especially humanoid bosses. But without it being able to use Beast Blood Pellets, being insanely slow, has a shit visceral damage, which I had to get all 3 claw runes just to make it okay, and it's stuck to arcane. This weapon is simply just bad for PvE. I can see the potential for PvP, but it's massively disappointing reward for beating the hardest boss in the game. And I'm glad I'll never have to use it again. So, fuck the cost parasite, let's go to the Rider Palash. The Rider Palash in its untrick form is a rapier that focuses on thrusting damage, whereas its trick form takes on more of a dagger moveset, but with the range of a sword. When in its trick form, its R2 shoots a bullet that does blood-tinged damage. The Rider Palash is the only weapon in Bloodborne that has an element type but can use paper as well, and is an amazing perk to have. I don't know what the fuck y'all are smoking, but the Rider Palash is fucking good. When in its trick form, it can do so many consecutive attacks leading to good beast meter buildup, which then leads to big damage, which then leads to killing bosses super fast. On top of that, it has no issues stun locking bosses. I could have one-cycled Ligarius if I would have been smart and used an oil urn at this moment. On top of that, it can do good thrust damage, so Rom, Amygdala, and Abrita stood no chance. The only boss that gave me trouble in base game were the Yarnum boys, which was only 1 death, and Mikolash only killing me twice because of his stupid one-shot capabilities. Heck, even the DLC was no match for this weapon. Ludwig first try, Lady Maria first try with some satisfying parries from the gun, Lawrence only took 3 tries because I became a bit trigger happy, and Orphan only took 2 tries. How in the hell is this weapon below cost parasite? Maybe in PvP situations, sure, but in PvE, hell fucking no. To top it off, I had no issues with Gurman or Moon Mommy. I had my fastest run with this weapon. It only took me 2 hours and 55 minutes to complete this run. Overall, the Rider Palash has great speed, good versatility with damage typing, amazing stun lock potential, good visceral damage, can use paper even with having a dedicated element, and builds good beast meter. The downsides are, the range is a bit short, which can lead to whiffing, and can't use either righteousness or serrated damage. Overall, a fucking crime to have this weapon this low. I get the gun part can deter you away, but don't let that stop you from trying this amazing weapon out. And with that, it's time for the final cycle, the Rifle Spear. The Rifle Spear is a spear in its untrick form and a halberd in its trick form. Both forms deal thrust and physical damage. In its trick form, it can shoot a spray of bullets like a shotgun, dealing blood tinge damage. I had used this weapon during my blood tinge only run, but made the mistake of thinking that blood tinge affected its physical damage, which led to me not thinking highly of the weapon, but luckily this run changed my mind. With this weapon being considered the worst weapon in the game by the community, I was expecting it to give me more trouble like the Cost Parasite did, but just like the Rider Palash, it proved to be way better than what the community thinks. Unfortunately, the Rifle Spear can't use paper, but even with that drawback, it didn't stop me from punishing some bosses. With the shotgun attached, it led for some good combos like right here with Amelia, where I was able to use the shotgun to knock back Amelia to then get a head break with the halberd. Not a single boss in base game gave me trouble, except for 1 death against Mikolash, but as stated earlier, he could be a bitch. I struggled mostly with Ludwig and Lawrence. For Ludwig, I just found that the weapon didn't really build beast meter well, so it would just prolong the fight at times, and for Lawrence, I got trigger happy with the shotgun on the first attempt in hopes of breaking his head, but ended up causing me to die. I then tried this 7 more times with no success. It wasn't until after I stopped trying to shoot his head that I was able to kill him. Sadly, the shotgun isn't that great at breaking heads. But I did find out that you can parry Gurman after he powers up, and the shotgun made easier work of that, plus it had great visceral damage from the thrust damage scaling. As bad as people say this weapon is, I was able to get my second fastest time at 3 hours and 27 minutes. Imagine if I did not die as many times as I did. With that said, let's talk about the weapon. The Rifle Spear has good range with good damage type versatility. The shotgun gives the weapon good stun lock potential while being able to parry while two-handing. And lastly, it has good visceral damage from the thrust damage. Sadly, this weapon cannot use paper, it does not build beast meter well, it can't use serrated damage or righteousness damage, and has a slow charge R2. Even with these flaws, I think I've shown how strong this weapon truly can be in a skilled hunter's hands. Definitely better than the Cost Parasites, that's for sure. With all that said, the run comes to an end. Now, if you're expecting a tier list from me, I will not be doing one. I did this run to show all weapons are viable, even the ones people say are bad. Except Cost Parasite, they were right about that one. So, to make it up to y'all, here is a list of how many times I died to a boss. And oh lord, Cost Parasite really helped out Orphan in the numbers. With that said, I want to thank my channel supporters. If you too would like to support the channel or have your name in the video, you can click the Patreon link in the description or the YouTube join button. I also want to give a special thanks to Catalan for helping me with gem farming locations, Pro, Cow, and German for helpful tips for each weapon, and everyone who came out to watch the stream. With that said, I want to thank you all for watching, and until next time, take care.